Well, for more on the situation in Syria and the Canadian government's position on it, I'm joined now by three MPs from the different parties. Matt DeCourcy is a Liberal MP for Fredericton and the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs. Michael Cooper is a Conservative MP for the Alberta riding of St. Albert, Edmonton. And Murray Rankin is the NDP House Leader. All three of you, thanks for taking the time.
Thanks for being here.
Okay, Mr. DeCourcy, I want to start off with the beginning of question period today because the opposition parties, or the Conservatives, asked the question. The Prime Minister, we've heard from him today. We've heard his comments and his statement. But one of the questions was yesterday he was saying with regards to this chemical weapons attack that we still didn't have enough evidence about who actually committed the atrocity. And he was also talking about going to the Security Council. Today, the Prime Minister is saying he's completely okay and supports the American intervention. What's changed? Why the change in 24 hours?
Well, Martin, I think it's important for Canadians to know that the government supports the limited and focused action taken by the U.S. to degrade the Assad regime's ability to use chemical weapons against its innocent population, including many children in Syria. That was made clear this morning by the Prime Minister. Earlier in the week, the Prime Minister made clear that the chemical weapons attack that was perpetrated upon innocent civilians in Syria was deplorable, was heinous. I know that Canadians across the country agree with him. We know that the use of chemical weapons constitutes a war crime. The Assad regime in the past has been found guilty of the use of such chemical weapons, and that's why we support the U.S.'s limited and focused action taken to degrade the Assad regime's ability to use chemical weapons against innocent civilians in Syria.
Okay, Michael Cooper, the Conservative Party's position on this, what your reaction to what we saw, the events we've seen over the last 2 days?
The U.S. strikes against the deplorable chemical attacks against civilians, including women and children, were necessary, they were appropriate, and they were proportionate. They send a clear message to the Assad regime that the Assad regime will not be able to get away with using these chemical weapons with impunity. And they also send an important message to Russia and Iran, who have assisted the Assad regime in butchering tens of thousands of people in Syria. So the proportionate response from the U.S. in the face of these chemical attacks is welcome. I must say, however, that I was disappointed with the response of the Prime Minister. It is good that he has now made clear unequivocally that he supports the proportionate and just response of the U.S. administration. But the Prime Minister was one of the last Western leaders to make his position clear. But what's worse is that yesterday, the Prime Minister was actually arguing that it should be Russia, Assad's ally, that should have determined the international response, because, after all, it was the Prime Minister who was calling on a meeting of the UN Security Council where Russia has a veto. So it really is concerning that the Prime Minister has been out of the loop in terms of the response taken by the United States, and also out of touch with essentially a go-along, get-along approach at the United Nations that has failed to resolve the Syrian crisis.
Okay, Murray Rankin, on behalf of the NDP, what do you make of the events? What do you make of the Canadian government's position to these attacks on the Syrian airbase?
Martin, we're very concerned about the nature of the response by the Government of Canada. As you started in your introduction, at one point the Prime Minister was all about multilateralism and the like, and today he apparently goes along with the unilateral action by Mr. Trump. I'm concerned about what the end game is. You know, President Obama used to always ask when evaluating military action, what is next? And so is Canada part of the decision-making here? Are we just nodding? What does it mean to say we support this? Does it mean this is part of a larger initiative that will involve the rest of the world? It's a very volatile region, and so we want Canada to ultimately be part of the solution in this difficult and dangerous part of the world. The crimes that Mr. Assad has inflicted upon his people are unimaginable, unspeakable. Is Canada going to be part of a diplomatic, peaceful solution, which ultimately will be political in nature, or are we just going along because Mr. Trump gave us a phone call?
Okay, Matt DeCourcy, I don't want to be too much of a legal formalist or anything, but has Canada given up on the UN Security Council? The question, when the Prime Minister yesterday, that was a Thursday, saying this should go through the UN Security Council, and today he is applauding and supporting a measure that doesn't go through the UN Security Council. And we've heard the arguments that it allegedly is paralyzed by Russian opposition. Have we given up on the UN Security Council? How can we support a measure like this and also say we're in support of a diplomatic solution?
Martin, as has been made clear by the Prime Minister, this was a limited and focused action taken by the U.S. to degrade the Assad regime. Our Prime Minister has also made it clear that we believe in a multilateral and diplomatic approach to an overall solution for the Syrian people to alleviate the suffering that has gone on for far too long. But it's important for Canadians to understand that as this was a U.S. action to destabilize and degrade the Assad regime's ability to use chemical weapons on innocents in Syria, Canada supports it, again, in that limited and focused action.
How do we know it's limited and focused? Who says so?
Okay, that's where I want to go now, because you raised that, Murray Rankin, to all three of you. What then, as Murray Rankin said, and as he quoted Barack Obama, what comes next? We have seen the Russians now announcing that they are going to deploy more anti-missile defenses in Syria on behalf of the Syrians. We've also seen them announcing that they're going to bring a ship with anti-missile capabilities closer to the Syrian coast. Matt DeCourcy, what's coming next? What's the next step?
Well, the Prime Minister made it clear again this morning that we want to see the entire world, the UN Security Council, stand in solidarity in denouncing and condemning the use of chemical weapons against innocent civilians. At the same time, it's important to note that our armed forces are part of a multilateral effort to help degrade Daesh and counter terrorism in the region, and we remain committed to that effort. Canadians, I know, are focused on doing whatever they can to help support the Syrian people and ensure that we come to a just and lasting peace for so many innocent civilians in that region of the world. That remains the commitment of this government, as iterated strongly by the Prime Minister, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and the Defense Minister today and in recent days. But in this action, given that it was a limited and focused action taken to degrade the Assad regime's ability to use chemical weapons, we support that because we know the use of chemical weapons is a war crime, and that should not ever be perpetrated against innocent civilians. Okay,
Michael Cooper, do you think that Canada should be ready to escalate if the situation escalates, and if the United States, for example, asks for more aid and more of a role by Canada in Syria? We are involved in Iraq and against Daesh, but what do you think on behalf of the Conservative Party?
Well, we need to work closely with our allies, and that includes the United States. That's key. Assad has used chemical weapons. He's used them before. He's been told repeatedly not to use them. He used them again. And so this response from the United States was appropriate, it was proportionate, and it sent the right message. So we need to continue to work with our allies, but what we cannot do is pass the buck to the UN Security Council, where Assad's ally, Russia, has a veto. It's not the policy of going along and getting along at the United Nations isn't the solution. What Canada must do is stand up for our values and the values of our allies, which is freedom, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. And we must be prepared to confront evil and tyranny wherever it exists.
Okay, Murray Rankin, on that possibility of escalation in either in the situation or in Canada's role, or both, what do you think?
I want to say what Michael said very eloquently. I agree with entirely. We really have to stand up and show the world what our values are. As a Canadian, though, I really want to make sure our contribution is to a lasting peace in this war-torn area. 6 years, horrible atrocities, including now chemical warfare. It has to stop. So what we're talking about is how we can best make that contribution. I agree with Matt when he talks about Canada's continuing humanitarian role. The question I have, though, Martin, is does this so-called limited and focused response lead to other limited and less focused response that aren't so limited, that takes us to a place where no one wants to go? Does Canada achieve a lasting contribution to a diplomatic and political solution by doing this. We need obviously more intelligence on the ground before we can fully evaluate that.
Okay, I've got a question point blank for the NDP. What about the Security Council? Your two colleagues on this panel have both said that given the Russian systematic blockage and support to Syria on the Security Council, it's time to forget about the Security Council.
I think we need to work with our allies. That might be through, and I hope it would be through, a United Nations force. I'm nervous about going alone with Donald Trump. I think the world our European allies might be able to add value, our Australians, as others in the world, but going it alone is a dangerous thing. However, I'm not prepared to give up on the United Nations. Canada should never give up on the United Nations. We should work diplomatically to improve the chances that that body can make a contribution here as well.
Okay, all three of you, I want to thank you very much for taking the time. Thanks for taking part in this, and obviously we'll watch this. The whole world watches this with great interest. Thanks a lot.
Thanks,
Thank you, Martin.